Awesome. Well, welcome to today's orientation for breaking 200 without burning out. So I want to walk you guys through a couple of key components for the course before we fully get immersed. And as I mentioned, today is the orientation. And so let me just really quickly introduce myself, just in case you don't know me. My name is Pastor Ariel. I'm a former discipleship pastor of a church of 4,000 members in New York City. And about maybe about 8, 9 years ago, I was sitting in a prayer meeting, and I remember the senior pastor was praying for a church that was going through some challenges. It was a smaller church, and I just remember God giving me a heart in that moment for smaller churches, and just having this epiphany that He has positioned me in a place where I was able to have some really great exposure to things that were helping churches grow, to great teachers, resources. And, like the question that popped in my heart was, well, what would happen if these other churches who didn't have the same level of influences, the same level of budget, what if they had access to these same resources? And so, this idea of breaking 200 and really this idea of becoming Thrive Church Coaching really started from the idea of, what if I can help smaller churches access resources that they could not afford before, but they can now leverage and utilize for the overall growth of the ministry. And so that's where we began, Thrive Church Coaching. This was maybe about 7 or 8 years ago that we started. And somewhere in the process, Pastor, how are you? Pastor Jim, how you doing? And glad to have you on. And so somewhere along in that process, what happened was I started working with pastors and I started working with churches, and we'd spend some time talking about how to reach more people, grow more people. And it was this common question that I kept getting. And they kept saying, or this common statement I kept hearing. And what they kept saying to me was, all the stuff you're teaching is great, but I don't have the time to do it myself. And I don't have enough volunteers to do it either. And this is what kind of led me to really a major epiphany when it came to working with smaller churches. And I realized that one of the biggest challenges that smaller churches were having was that the pastor wasn't only just pastoring, he was also doing all of the work. And so there was a level of overwhelm and there was a level of stress that was connected with the actual ministry, because this was his baby and he was driving every aspect of it. And so it was leading to overwhelm. It was leading to being tired, frustrated. I had pastors who were working full-time jobs and then taking a major portion of their income and putting it and investing it into the ministry, because the ministry couldn't handle it themselves. And that was causing some stress in their marriages. And it was just a lot of challenges because of this component of the pastor kind of having his hand or being the main driver of the growth of the ministry. And so it led to a moment where I read Ephesians 4:12, and I just had a Bible in front of me. Okay, here it is. And the verse really stood out to me and became a crucial component of my training. And it just says in Ephesians 4:12, and it just says this, talking about the fivefold ministry, right? Those who are called to apostleship, to prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And it just said that their responsibility was to prepare God's people for works of service. And when I read that, it just dawned on me. So many of us were doing the works of service, but our responsibility was actually to prepare people for works of service. And that led me to this, what we call the Ephesians 4:12 framework, which is really going to be the core emphasis of what we're going to be spending our time on. And so the first leg of it was to organize and provide clarity. The second leg was to turn guests to engage members. The third was creating an evangelistic culture. The fourth was to stop leading alone. And then the fifth was to develop and disciple future leaders. And so I took this framework and turned it into this actual course. And so what we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks begins with module number one, which number one is already available and open. So before we jump off today, I just want to check in and make sure that everybody has access to module one, because that's already open. So module number one is this idea of next level ministries. And before we jump into the framework, one of the key components of the framework is going to be your ability to lead. And so in module one, we spent some time talking about two types of leaders. We spent some time talking about the actual framework, what it means for you to lead your ministries effectively, because the growth of the ministry is directly connected to your personal growth. Then module two, we're going to spend some time talking about God's real intent for your church. And this is what I call the foundation of your ministry. And this is where I remember going into the city. I went to school in New York City, in Manhattan. And while I was at school, there was this massive hole in the ground. All these guys with hard hats and machinery, and they were digging and building and doing all this stuff. Fast forward about 5-6 years later, I go to have dinner in the city with my wife. And as we're walking around in the city, we pass by and we see this beautiful building. It was all glass. It was huge. It was beautiful. And I was just like, man, I don't remember this building. And that's when it clicked. It was like, wait a minute, this building was that massive hole in the ground. And as I thought about it, I just felt God kind of say to me, hey, if you want to build up, you first have to grow down. Like, you've got to solidify your foundation in order to build high. And that's where what we do in this module, right? Before we talk about cool strategies and reaching out communities and all these things, our focus for module two is to get very clear on who has God called us to be as a church, and how do we communicate that to the people around us, so that way we're all running in the same direction, right? Sometimes when I think of ministry, I don't know if you remember, if any of you have seen that movie Rocky. There's that scene where Rocky 1, where he's being trained, and he's in the alley somewhere, and he's chasing chicken, right? And he's trying to, like increase his speed and his agility, but he's chasing chicken. And I said, sometimes that's what ministry feels like, right? You've got ministry leaders going one way, people going another way, and it feels like everything is all over the place. But our goal with module number two is to get clear on direction, so everyone is running in the same direction. And then we get to module number three, and this is where the fun stuff really begins. And here we're going to spend some time talking about turning new guests into fully engaged members. And this is where we talk about our assimilation connection process, right? From how do you get a first-time guest into the building? What are they going to look? What is that first visit going to look like? How do we follow up? What's our membership class supposed to look like? And then how do we onboard new people? Right? They've gone through your membership class. Now what? And so literally we walk you through this process. On top of that, there are templates that we'll hand over to you. So that way, instead of having to create things from scratch, you'll be able to just utilize what we've created as a foundation for you. And on top of that, one of the biggest elements that we spend time talking about in this specific module is going to be, how do we create a welcoming environment for our guests? And so at the end of May, one of the things that we'll do is, on a Thursday evening, you will invite all of your first impressions teams to a session on a Thursday evening. And I will personally train them and help them so that way they can increase their ability to create a welcoming environment in your church. And so that'll be on Thursday. And I've got a schedule of everything that I'll show you in a slide in a moment. Module 4, we're going to spend some time talking about creating a culture of evangelism. And one of the biggest things that's important about evangelism is, seen this a couple of years ago. We were helping out a church. They were trying to do an Easter egg hunt, and I went to their setup, And they were in a community that I would say was high, upper middle class community. But when I looked at their setup, right, everything was done. It seemed like it was done in crayons, and signs were drawn, and it really looked. It looked like, I want to be careful saying this, but it looked like a child was creating the signs, right? So they were trying to communicate and appeal to a community that was upper middle class, but their design, their approach felt like it wasn't quite created for that community. And so one of the biggest things that we'll talk about is getting to know our community, so that way we can craft our outreach in a way that's going to be effective to reach them, right? So many times we want to reach people the way we want to be reached versus reaching people based on their needs, their challenges, their circumstances. And so that's module number 4. And module number 5, we're going to talk about breaking the Pastor Does Everything culture. And we talked a little bit about it earlier. This is where we spend some time talking about your teams. How are we going to structure your teams? How are we going to develop your teams? Like, who should be on your team and who should not be on your team? And then I'm going to give you a couple of specific suggestions on how to actually evaluate people in your ministry to decide if they have the potential to lead at that capacity. And I'll give you one quick hint ahead of time. One of the biggest ways to know if someone is right for positioned for leadership is based on their level of commitment, right? So one of the things that we do is we test commitment, and we'll talk about that in more detail here. But what that looked like for me was literally we did a leadership session. We had about 20 guys we invited. It was me and another pastor. Our senior pastor taught. And at the end, we gave everybody a book. And we said, hey, you've got 30 days to read this book. When you finish reading this book, get back to us and we'll insert you in our leadership development process. We had about 20 guys. From the 20 guys, we had one person who got back to us. So how many people do you think we invested in? One person, because that person showed that they were committed. And I had a deacon who told me this a long time ago. She said to me, never pour into a cup that has a hole in the bottom. Right? And so I don't know about you, but I've poured into many cups and realized, oh, this one's got a hole in the bottom. Right? This person wasn't ready for this. This person wasn't as committed. This person wasn't implementing. They weren't passionate, or maybe they didn't have the right. They weren't mature enough at that season. And so I found myself saying, okay, before we pour ourselves into people, let's see if their cup has a hole in the bottom. And then the last module, we'll talk about developing and discipling future leaders. And here we're going to help you create an actual leadership development process. And I don't like calling it leadership development. I got to find a better title for it, because it is leadership, but it's also discipleship. Because at the end of the day, in our context, you can't be a leader if you're not first a disciple, right? And so we'll walk you through a discipleship framework, and then we'll also walk you through a leadership framework, so that way you can begin implementing and developing leaders, right? So that way you're not doing ministry alone. And here's one thing that's crucial. Pastor Manuel just said, yep, that there's a verse that says, don't cast your pearls into the pigs. Yeah, so it's an idea. It's definitely, I appreciate that. I didn't even connect that verse with that thought. But it's important for us to just remember that not everyone is ready to lead, and not everyone is ready to be elevated to another level. And so we want to create a process by which we're developing people and then positioning them, right? So it's almost like as we equip them, then we want to give them an opportunity to utilize those giftings that we've given them. And so these are 6 modules. So here's the schedule. Here's how it's in essence going to work. So every Wednesday at 3 p.m., a module will open. with the exception of module number 1, because module number 1 has already been opened. But every Wednesday, so starting next week on the 19th at 3 p.m., module 2 will open up. You'll have access to watch module 2. You'll have, all the time you need. And then on the following week, Wednesday at 1 o'clock, we'll have the implementation call. Okay, so next week, Wednesday, April 19th, we'll have our implementation call based on module 1. So when you come in, there'll be some assignments, some stuff that you'll get from the actual module that we'll review. Because again, our goal isn't just information. And you'll hear me say this maybe 1,000 times. By the time we're done, you're going to be sick of me saying this line. But my goal is not just information, it is implementation, because implementation always leads to transformation, right? And all of them end with an Asian. So they all rhyme, so you know it's true. So information isn't enough. I don't want to just give you a lot of information. I want to help you take this thing and figure out, how do I contextualize this for my specific church? So for example, Pastor Manuel, you're in Chicago. Pastor Jim is in Atlanta. Pastor Ed is in Queens, New York, Brooklyn, New York, right? So your contexts are different. So your implementation might look a little different. But that's where our implementation calls are for. So I can take a look at what you've created, what your teams have created. So every Wednesday, right? So today is our orientation. Technically this afternoon, module 1 would have been opened. It's already opened. Next week at 1 o'clock, we'll have our implementation call for module 1. And then at 3 o'clock, module 2 will open up. Okay, just want to make sure that's clear. And then a couple of other items. So on Wednesday, May 10th, we've got a couple of other bonus modules. They will open up. I didn't open them up yet because I don't want them to distract from the main thing. And so some of those bonuses are going to be bonuses on finances. I have a training that I did on one church that was a church of about 65, 70. I helped them raise about $10,000 within 4 weeks. So I'm sharing that training as a bonus. We also have a couple of other bonuses on leadership. We call it a virtual retreat that you can take and utilize and actually work with your team. And then, as I mentioned, the first impressions training. So this will be your usher team leaders, anyone who's part of your leadership teams. They will, your first impressions teams, they'll be able to meet with us on Thursday, May 25th at 8 p.m. And that's where we'll do some training with them. All right. So we'll train them on how to create a welcoming environment for your guests. And then June 1st, we're going to do a team meeting training. And so what's going to happen is, in our modules, we're going to talk about developing what we call an executive team, or you might call it a leadership team. We called it a core leadership team at one point. We called it a cabinet. So whatever title you want to use, the idea is that we want to be able to disseminate responsibility among different leaders. And so one of the key components is a team meeting. This team meeting is crucial for keeping the momentum going. And so I want to teach you and your team how to run that meeting. So that will be June 1st. So you'll be able to jump on the call with your team, and we'll actually put you in, we'll walk you through the process, and then we'll put you inside of different breakout rooms so you and your team can actually practice what it's like to run a team meeting. This is one of the most important tools that you can use, is running a team meeting. And we do it, we call it an agendaless meeting, meaning you don't have to go into the meeting with a full agenda. I don't know about you. I used to run a meeting and I would have this full agenda and I'd be racking my, what do we need to talk about? What do we need to talk about? I can't miss anything important. And I'd walk away frustrated, because what would happen is after the meeting, everybody still wanted to meet again. because the things that I thought were important, they still had other questions on. And so we ended up being in a position where it was a little bit overwhelming. So we started a team meeting and just completely transformed how I was able to lead teams because we were all working together. And then let me just give you a couple of quick keys to success. Here's the first key. Don't do this. Don't go through this class alone. So when you registered for the class, part of what we have available is if you send us names and emails of other key leaders, we will give them full access to the class, just like the access you have. The reason I do this, twofold. Number one is because I know that I've been in positions where, for example, I've gone to conferences and then I go back to my team and I talk about what I learned in the conference, and I was excited, but no one else was as excited. Why? Because they didn't have the full experience that I did. Right. So I want your teams. You've got people who you feel are leaders who can help you. Sign them up. Right. Send me their name and their email, and I will create an account for them. Okay. And that way they can follow along with us. Number two, they can help you implement a lot of the stuff. So the things that we're talking about. So for example, membership, you might already have somebody on your team who can help you create the membership class or teach the membership class. Fantastic. Have them join us. And if they're available during the day at 1 p.m. Eastern, even better, have them join us. If they're not available, then let them watch the trainings on their own time. Okay? But at least that way you're bringing your team together. Key to success number two is make about 2 hours to watch and do any homework. I think 2 hours, maybe 3. If you want to watch the video slow, then that's fine, or watch the videos over and over again. But about 2 hours a week is what you'll need in terms of being able to watch the videos and also do any of the homework. Most of the trainings, the way it works, every module is broken up into smaller lessons, and most lessons are 10 to 15 minutes max. So that way you can watch the lessons, work on anything, and then make sure you get the dates on your calendar. Okay, so again, all the modules open on the 12th, the 19th, the 26th, the 3rd, the 10th, and the 17th. This is when the modules open. Okay. The implementation calls Wednesday, April 19th, Wednesday, April 26th, Wednesday, May 3rd, Wednesday, May 10th, Wednesday, May 17th, and Wednesday, May 24th, all at 1 p.m. And then lastly, the bonus session, right? The first impressions training, that's Thursday, May 25th. And then the team meeting training is Thursday, June 1st. Okay, so just make sure that we get those on the calendar. And then the last thing is this. Ask questions. Like, there's no dumb question. I think the saying is the only dumb question is the question that doesn't get asked. So ask questions. If something isn't clear, if you're not sure how to implement something, if you have a challenge, man, I'm hearing what you're saying, Pastor, but I can't do it this way. I need help with X, Y, and Z. Ask questions, right? That helps me to be able to really contextualize the training for you. And again, the strategies work. The implementation, how you do it in your cultural context, that's where I can, during our implementation calls, really help you figure out how to do this thing, right? That way you're not doing this all by yourself. Okay. So I'm going to hit stop to the record, and